You working on a Kawasaki? What are you doing?
So we're going to do a little clutch maintenance first. And to get to the clutch cover, we have to pull off the rear brake lever. Sometimes you can compress the caliper and get the pedal to go down far enough to clear, but it's just one bolt, so it's pretty easy to remove, get it out of the way. So first thing is to take out the pin for the master cylinder. Just bend it with some pliers, it's a little cotter pin, and then there's just a pin that slides out. So we can put that back in there, put the cotter pin back in for safekeeping.
Yeah, that's a good tip. Always lose that.
Yep. If it's old, you probably want to replace it, but this one I think's only been installed for a couple weeks. It's only been bent back once or twice. So the next thing is take a 8mm Allen socket and unbolt the brake lever pivot bolt. These have some Loctite on them, so it's going to take a little bit of turning to get that out.
Is there anything to check for while you're doing this?
Check if there's, free play in the lever, in the pin. Sometimes the pin gets kind of ovaled out where it connects to the master cylinder, and you get a lot of free play there. Also the actual pivot, it's a bearing on some bikes, so that can get worn out and get a little floppy. And you also have that spring you got to pull off, the brake lever return spring. That's another thing to check. Those can get weak over time and it won't hold up the brake lever anymore. You might get some dragging on your rear brake. Now we're gonna take off the actual clutch cover. First thing, it's always good to wipe down around the gasket area and just wipe down around the general area, because we're gonna be opening the engine and we don't want any dirt or debris falling inside the motor. So give it a good wipe down. It's always good to wash your bike before you do maintenance. Just makes it a little less of a headache when there's no dirt falling in places where it shouldn't be. So we got it all cleaned up, and we have, I believe, 5 or 6 8mm bolts. We're just gonna go in around the cover and loosen them all up first, crack them loose, and then we'll remove them.
I see you have the bike tilted pretty well. Just keep the oil from coming out.
Yeah, that's a good point. You can do this on a stand or with the bike upright, but you have to drain the oil first. But if you get the bike tilted to the left, you can get all the oil to the left side, and then you can pull the clutch cover off and not make a huge mess with the oil spilling out. So we just have the bike tilted and leaned on a table, and the handlebar is actually on top of the table, which keeps it up.
Yeah, guys, if you plan to tilt, make sure that table is on a wall so it doesn't slide. Bikes are pretty heavy.
Yep, so we pull out all the bolts. Just one of them, all the way at the bottom, is longer. The rest are all the same length. It's pretty self-explanatory, so you don't really need to take note of it. It's only going to go back one way. And now we can just wiggle the cover, pull it off, and just take note of these little pins. They're the dowel pins that locate the cover. And here we're just checking, make sure they're there, either in the cover or in the motor. We just don't want them to fall into the motor. So if you're missing one, you really want to check at the bottom of the crankcase and make sure you didn't drop one in there while you're pulling the cover off.
So here for visual inspection, you're looking for any deformation?
Yeah, we're just looking for anything out of the ordinary, any weird metal shavings, loose bolts, anything like that. With this cover, really we can only see the clutch pressure plate. So as we get deeper in there, we'll be able to inspect more. But the first thing is to just pull out the 5 pressure plate bolts that hold the clutch springs. They're 10mm bolts.
I see you're cleaning your bolt sockets. Afraid to drop any dirt, I guess.
Right, right. It's always good to clean the sockets when you're working inside the engine because you may have been using them for something dirty or on the external side of the bike, and then you can introduce that dirt into the motor. So all the sockets we're using inside the motor, we try to keep them clean, blow them out with compressed air if you need to. So here we're just holding the clutch by hand, and these bolts aren't torqued very tight, so you can crack them loose very easily. And then we're going to evenly back them out. That way we're not putting a lot of stress from the spring on any one bolt. So just give each one a couple turns and go around until there's no more tension on the bolts, and then you can unscrew them all the way. So once you have these all the way out, it's just a bolt with a spring behind it. You're going to want to carefully remove these, put them on a clean surface, because you will be putting these back in the motor. You don't want to pick up any dirt. It's not important what order they go in, they're all the same. So just carefully take them out, put them on a clean work table. Make sure not to lose anything. Those washers should be captive on the bolts, so usually they're not going to fall off or anything like that. And once we get those off, we'll be able to take the pressure plate off, and then we're going to actually inspect the clutch plates and the nut that holds the clutch basket on, which is the main reason why we're doing this inspection. On the KX250, the clutch basket nut, it's really just staked in place. There's no lock washer or anything like that. So we want to take this apart and just make sure that nut hasn't moved. So now we have the 5 bolts out that hold the pressure plate and clutch springs, and we can carefully wiggle out the pressure plate cover. Sometimes the friction disc on the top will stick to the cover, so just wiggle it off. And here we're just looking over everything, looking at all the friction surfaces, making sure none of the friction pads on the clutch discs are worn out. We're going to pull out the bearing and the little holder for the bearing that goes on the clutch push rod. And we can wiggle that around, turn it, make sure it's spinning freely, make sure that bearing's good. And underneath that is the clutch push rod. Goes to the other side of the motor where the clutch cable attaches. So that's not really a wear item, should be nothing, no issues with that. So again, we're putting everything on a clean little work surface. These are all internal engine components, so we don't want any dirt or debris getting on them. And it'll also just save you a lot of cleaning time. You could throw these back in the motor and not worry about, cleaning any dirt off of them. So next thing we're going to do is pull out all the clutch friction discs and the metal discs and just inspect everything. Really here we're just checking the metal discs, making sure they're not overheated. And the way you would know if they're overheated is they'll be discolored. They'll be blue or purple from the metal heating up so much. They can also be warped, so just pay attention to that. And as far as the friction discs, there's a way to measure them basically. If you look into a service manual, it'll tell you exactly how thick in millimeters those discs should be. And it'll tell you the service limit. So basically what's the thinnest they could be before you need to replace them. Usually we'll just run it until the clutch starts slipping and then we'll replace it. So we're not going to go into greater detail about measuring those discs and everything. We just want to make sure the clutch is operating properly, nothing's overheating. And the bike really didn't have any clutch issues, so we're not expecting the friction material to be worn out, or we're not expecting to find anything crazy in here. But while we're here, it's good to check just in case. So the the deeper clutch discs and friction discs, they're a little tough to get out. So we're using a pick to just grab the edge of it and pull them out. And again, just inspecting each one, making sure there's no warpage of the disc and no discoloration. So this one looks fine, and they all look fine so far. So everything's going according to plan.
Are those metal discs directional?
They're not directional. If you look in the service manual, it won't tell you whether to put them, one way or the other. But if you look at them, you will notice that they have a soft edge and a sharper edge from the stamping of the metal. And the general consensus from most technicians is you want to put them all facing the same direction. Doesn't matter if it's the sharp end first or the soft end, but just to put them all in the same direction and be consistent. So pulling these out one by one, I believe there's 8 or 9 in this clutch pack. Could vary depending on the bike, but it's always going to start with a friction disc and end with a friction disc. So just something to keep in mind if you bought a bike and you're taking it apart for the first time and you're just checking to make sure that the previous owner had assembled everything correctly. So again, if you were taking apart the clutch basket, you could remove that nut and just pull out the whole basket with all the plates together instead of trying to pry them out like what we're doing. We're not going to take the clutch basket out, so we're just taking them out one at a time. It's a little more labor intensive, but for the inspection, this is the quickest way of doing it. So the last few are a little bit of a pain to get to, but just be patient and pull out all those plates. And don't force anything, it should come out pretty easy.
Yeah, I see you taking your time, finessing it with the pick on all sides.
Yep, just try to pick it up from one side, put your finger in there, and try to pick it up from the other side, and they should slide out. They can also get a little bit sticky if you just got the bike and maybe it's been sitting for a while. Some of these plates can stick together and be a little bit of a pain to get out, so just keep that in mind. Be patient with removing everything.
And if you were to have more debris or some shavings in there, would you suggest just pull the basket out?
Yeah, if you do see metal shavings or, metal pieces of any kind, then you definitely want to take the basket out, maybe even take the whole side cover out where the Kickstarter is and everything. Take that whole assembly off and try to determine where that metal is coming from. But you will notice, even in this bike, you see the oil on the bottom of the basket there, that it's a little dark and there's probably some very fine shavings in there. That's pretty normal. The clutch is spinning in oil, so all the debris from the clutch is mixing with the oil, making it darker and just shedding some metallic material. So it's nothing to be concerned about, but you do want to change the oil once it gets dark like that. So if you notice, we're taking all the clutch plates off and putting them on the workbench exactly as they came out of the bike. And this just makes it easier and kind of a no-brainer to reassemble it when you go back to put everything together. So we're just checking the rotation of the inner hub. You don't want any side-to-side play in here. There is a bearing that this rides on that can get worn out, so just spin everything around by hand, make sure there's no excessive play in anything. And what we're really here to check is the torque of this nut, which holds the basket on. It's very important that this nut not come off. As you can imagine, could cause a lot of damage. So on the Kawasaki, as we mentioned, the way it's locked on is by taking a punch and hitting it with a hammer between the nut and the shaft. So we want to make sure that nut is torqued. It's good to check it maybe let's say every 20 hours, since it doesn't have a very positive locking method like a lock nut. So anyway, we're going to check the torque. We're going in our service manual right here, and we're going to look up the torque, and I believe it's 72 foot-pounds. So now we're going to actually go ahead and torque that nut. It's a 30 millimeter socket, and you're going to have a method for holding the inner clutch hub. There's a lot of tools from Motion Pro and Tusk that you can purchase. They're pretty inexpensive, but since we have welding capabilities here, we just whipped up a little tool from some 3/16 plate and a bar. So basically it just slips between the little fingers here on the inner clutch basket. It's a pretty tight fit. You want it to be pretty tight so there's no excess stress on the corners of the hub. Slips in there, and it's kind of offset a little bit so you can get the socket on the nut. You might need to play with the alignment of the tool, put it on some different fingers just to get access to the nut. So once you have that on there, you're going to throw your socket on. And as you can see, it's a little bit too tight right now. So we're just going to adjust the tool onto the next tooth and make a little more room for the socket. And you just want to make sure the tool is slid all the way in there. You don't want to be putting a lot of stress just on the top edge of those fingers. You want the whole groove to be engaged. And you just want to be careful in general with the clutch hub and the basket because they are made of aluminum and you can crack it if you're not careful. And there's a lot of ways to do this. You could also put the bike in gear and put all the clutch discs in, and that'll hold it. But the tool is the best way to go if you're doing this on a regular basis. So we're going to set our torque wrench to 72 foot-pounds, just like the service manual says. And then we'll see if we can get that bolt to click. Hopefully it's still properly torqued. Hopefully it doesn't move at all. And that'll give us some confidence to know that it's staying on there well and shouldn't be coming off. So we have a little extension bar we're going to put on the tool just to give us a little more leverage. It is a decent amount of torque we're putting on this. And you could just hold this with your knee or with your other hand and give it a couple of clicks, and we're good to go. So the nut didn't move, which is exactly what we were looking for. So nothing to worry about there. It was all torqued, and hopefully next time we check it, it'll be the same thing. And that's just why we do the maintenance. Just make sure everything's good on the bike, and then you have confidence in the machine and you can ride it properly knowing nothing's going to fall off. So as we talked about before, those three little points you see are the stake marks. Those are the stock marks. We don't really stake it, every time we do this maintenance, because if you do need to remove the clutch basket, it's a little more difficult. And also we don't want to be pounding on that nut and shaft. So now we're getting ready to put all the clutch discs back in. And like we mentioned before, we took them out and put them on our workbench in the same order as they were in the bike. So we're just going to flip them and put them back in the reverse order. So we start with a friction disc, make sure it goes all the way in there. And then we're just going to alternate the friction and the metal discs. And as we talked about before, there's a soft edge and a sharp edge on these metal plates. And you just want to be consistent with which way you're putting them in. So either all soft edges or all sharp edges. We're putting the soft edges in towards the engine. So we're just going to check each plate and make sure it's oriented the right way. And we'll be dropping these in. So the soft edge and the hard edge, it's just from the stamping process when these are manufactured. The idea is just to, with the soft edge being inside, theoretically it would make the engagement of the clutch a little bit smoother. So next is another friction disc. Make sure these are bottomed out all the way. They should slide in easily with no resistance. You can put a little oil on the clutch hub if it's dry, and that'll help things along. So now we got all the friction and metal discs in the clutch hub. You'll know it's assembled correctly. The height of the stack should be almost to the top of the clutch basket. And of course you should end up with the friction disc as the last disc, and the actual pressure plate acts as the last metal disc. So we're inserting the clutch push rod, give it a little wiggle, make sure it goes in all the way, and then we're putting the sleeve and the bearing onto the push rod. Make sure that's bottomed out all the way also, and make sure it spins freely. It's better to be sure about this, make sure everything's in there properly. You definitely don't want to bolt this on and force anything into place. So just take your time and make sure everything's in the correct orientation. And then we're going to put the pressure plate on there loosely. Just align it with the 5 bosses for the bolts. Align that up and slide it in. And it should contact the clutch plates and also contact the bearing in the middle. That's how you'll know everything's together correctly. And then we just go ahead and start installing the clutch springs. You just want to get these started, get the thread started, and then we're going to evenly tighten them down, similar to how we took them off. You could use an impact gun or a drill driver to get these screwed in, but just get them started by hand first. Again, these are aluminum parts, so it's very easy to strip them or crack off those bosses where the bolts go in. So we got all of them started at this point, and we're just going to start going around and getting them as tight as we can by hand. And then we'll use a 10mm socket to get them all the way tight onto the pressure plate. There's a torque spec for these bolts also, you can find in the service manual. I believe it's about 7 foot-pounds. Most people just snug these down by hand. They're only 6mm thread bolts, so it's very easy to strip them or damage them if you over tighten. So just be very careful with these. It's better to have them a little on the loose side than on the tight side. They don't require any Loctite or anything like that. It's pretty rare for them to come out.
Well, you're snugging them in the star pattern. Is that a must?
Yeah, you could either go in a star pattern or just go around in a circle. The most important thing is just to kind of get them down evenly so there's not excess pressure on one particular bolt, so that the pressure plate is going down evenly and the load is distributed on it. So we're just going to tighten these until the bolts bottom out, and then we'll put a torque wrench on these and give them all a click. Just take your time with this, make sure there's no resistance. These bolts should be covered in oil, so they should screw in very nicely. You shouldn't have to force it. And we're just about getting snugged up on these. Make sure you got all 5 of them all the way down. And then we'll grab our torque wrench. Just remember the service manual might give you the torque setting in inch pounds, so just don't confuse that with foot pounds. So the torque is 78 inch pounds or 6.5 foot pounds for these bolts. So take your small torque wrench, and we're setting it to 78. It's already set up. And again, we're going to clean our socket, not to introduce any dirt in the motor. And just go around, hold the clutch basket with your hand, and give each one a click. It's always good to go around the second time. Just make sure you didn't miss any bolts. And once we have that all taken care of, only thing left to do is put the cover back on and to put the brake pedal back on. So final torque here, make sure we got them all, make sure they all click, and obviously good to check the pressure plate, make sure there's no weird loose play. I'm going to test out the clutch right here. I'm pulling on the lever and you can see the action of the clutch moving. So we got the cover here. What we're going to do is we're going to put a little bit of grease. I think we're using general purpose grease here. It's not too important what brand or type of grease it is. The purpose here is just to lubricate the gasket a little bit, so when we do this maintenance again, the gasket doesn't stick to the engine case, because if it sticks and rips the gasket, we have to go out and get a new gasket, and it's not a huge deal, but just saves a few bucks every time you take it off. And also the grease just helps everything to seat down better in its place, helps everything rub together and seat properly. So we're going to do that, and then we're just going to carefully once again check the dowel pins. Make sure you got both the dowel pins. They can be either in the case or in the cover. Just important that they're both there, and of course that they didn't fall anywhere out of the bike or in the engine. So we carefully line up the two dowel pins. I'm going to wiggle it on. Again, just take your time. No need to force anything. It should pop right on once the dowel pins are aligned. And then we just take our bolts and thread them down. As we mentioned before, there's just one long one and the rest are all the same length. And you'll see there's really only one way they can all go in there. That's the long one that we put in first. And then we go around and put the bolts on. They're all put together. This is the grease we used. Again, doesn't really matter the brand or type. This is some Valvoline general purpose grease. So just something on there to lubricate the cover and make sure it's easy to take off the next time we do this maintenance. So we're getting all the bolts in. We're going to run them down and then we're going to torque them. The torque is the same as the clutch spring bolts, 78 inch pounds. So you could either snug these up by hand, or if you do have the small torque wrench that measures inch pounds, just set that up to 78 and give it a click. Again, definitely better to leave these a little bit on the loose side if there's any doubt. It's very easy to strip these threads or snap the bolts, so just be careful. It doesn't need much pressure at all to seal the cover. So we got them all snug down. Just double checking. And we're going to grab our torque wrench. I'm going to throw an 8mm socket on there. These bolts are outside the engine, so we don't have to go crazy cleaning sockets or anything. So just go around and take your time. Some of these torque wrenches, when they're set at the low settings, it's a little difficult to hear the click, so just make sure you're paying attention and you don't go too tight. Our cover's all put together and we're just going to give it a last wipe down. There might be a little bit of grease that seeps out the cover since we put that on the gasket, and we're just cleaning it all up. That's going to make it easier in the future to check for any leaks if we have a nice clean surface. And the last step is just to reinstall the rear brake lever. First thing on this bike is it's easiest to put the spring onto the frame, and then you're going to insert the end of the lever into the master cylinder. And then the last thing is just start threading the pivot bolt. Again, just take your time with this bolt. The threads on these sometimes have Loctite, so they don't go in very easily. But just take your time, make sure you have it aligned. And you definitely don't want to strip any bolts on the frame. So run it down there, take your time. You could torque this one, we just tighten it by hand. This is something you should really check every ride or couple of rides to make sure it's not loosening it up. So we just torque it by hand, and when we do a bolt check on the bike, we'll just put a ratchet on there and make sure it's still good. So we give this a nice little tug, get it tight, and then we're going to insert the pin into the brake master cylinder. Helps if you put a little bit of grease on this, helps keep the pin from ovaling out the hole too much, and just helps it have a smoother operation, and also keeps it from rusting when you wash the bike. So a little bit of grease. We're using the same general purpose Valvoline grease. It's not too important what type of grease you're using here. Insert that in there. We like to put the cotter pin on the inside just so it doesn't snag your boot or anything like that. You can put it on the outside, either way is fine. And now we're just going to reinsert our cotter pin. The one we had is still in good shape. If yours is a little beat up, it's pretty inexpensive to get a new one. You can buy a set of these cotter pins for just a few bucks. So we're going to insert that into the little hole on the other side. It's a little bit more work to do it on the with the cotter pin facing inside, but just helps it from getting snagged on your boot or anything like that. And then last step, we're just going to take some needle nose pliers and bend up the cotter pin so the pin stays in the hole, and test out the brake pedal, make sure everything's good, and we're good to go.